It's my great privilege to welcome Leonard Dung from Ruhr-Universität Bochum. Today, he will be speaking to us about an argument for the possibility of conscious non-biological systems. Thanks for being here with us, Leonard. Please take it away.
Thank you very much for the invitation and for the great conference so far. It's been very interesting and also particularly interesting for me because I don't actually know that much about speech acts. So I'm going to talk about consciousness in AI here. And I think we've already seen in some of the last talks that there might be some connections between attributions of consciousness to AI systems and attributions of like the capacity for doing speech acts. So yeah, this is my invitation in the discussion to, also if you're interested in that, brainstorm together how actually what I'm presenting here on AI consciousness might be related to speech acts and AI and large language models. So the question I will be concerned with is the question of what it takes for AI systems to have phenomenal consciousness, where phenomenal consciousness is something like subjective experience, there being something it is like to be an organism or system, something like having a first person point of view, like the subjectivity of experience. And important current research efforts in that domain include things like looking at theories of consciousness and seeing what they imply for AI systems, conceiving of empirical, also behavioral tests for artificial consciousness, and exploring the ethical significance it would have if AI systems were conscious. One central point of contention in this debate is whether consciousness requires biology. So there's some views with that implication. One you might call biological substrate views, which say that consciousness requires like a biological carbon-based substrate, implying that functionalism is false. So like implementing the right kind of functions, having the right kind of causal organization is actually not sufficient for consciousness. Instead, conscious creatures also need to be made out of the right kind of material, namely biological material. One example of this is like a type identity view where consciousness is taken to be identical to a particular brain stage. A different kind of view, which also ties consciousness to biology, might be called biological function view, which says that realizing certain functions is necessary for consciousness, where the relevant functions include like fine-grained biological functions, things like having a metabolism, certain system-wide synchronization, oscillation properties that we only find in biological brains, maybe things, functions whose implementation depends on like very specific biochemical features and so on. So that's like two kinds of views which imply that at least we should be very skeptical of consciousness in AI systems. There are other biological views which might say that there are like constraints on the substrates or functions of consciousness which are not like definitionally very closely tied to biology, but as a matter of fact, can only be satisfied by biological organisms and not by things made from like silicon-based matter. And I will just call all of these positions, the three positions that we heard of just now, biological views of consciousness, because they think having biology is necessary for consciousness. So this debate between biological and non-biological views, consciousness seems to be one of the most important, arguably the most important determinant for researchers' views on the prospects of AI consciousness. So on biological views, artificial consciousness is probably far in the future, if it is at all possible. And also, if conscious artificial systems are developed, they will not conform to currently dominant AI paradigms, like large language models in anything like the form that we have now will be just the wrong kind of thing to be conscious. So if we expect to have conscious artificial systems, it might be something like neural organoids, like lab-grown and neural tissue, or molecular computers, or computers which try to more closely emulate design principles and physical structure of biological systems. On the other hand, so the typical opponent of biological views is this view called computationalism, that implementing the right kinds of computations is sufficient for consciousness and biology is not essential. And many authors have said that actually, given computationalism, it's very plausible that we will relatively soon have AI systems which are conscious. So there was this big review by a lot of very prominent authors in the field, 2023, which concluded that given computationalism, there are no obvious barriers to building conscious AI systems, even though they also concluded that no current AI systems are conscious. And different authors have argued that, at least given computationalism, near-term AI consciousness in the next years, the next decade, is a serious possibility. So seems very important where we think consciousness actually requires biology or doesn't require biology. The goal of this talk is to develop or present at least sort of the main thrust of a new argument for the view that AI consciousness is possible and thereby against biological views. And the basic idea I'm going to develop is based on two ideas. One, that we should make our beliefs about the AI consciousness question conform to the outcomes of like an ideal scientific process, and that such an ideal scientific process, so science as best as it could like hypothetically be done, would attribute consciousness to some possible non-biological AI systems. And if both is true, then this implies that AI systems can be conscious. So to get started with the argument, I first need to talk about what I imagine like this scientific process to be, which I will call the iterative natural kind strategy, following also ideas in the literature. And then I have to talk about what the relevant kinds of AI systems are, which would be conscious according to that strategy. And I will call those psychological duplicates. So what will happen now is that I first explain these two ideas, and then once I have explained them, I can give you sort of the real full argument for AI systems being capable of consciousness. So the iterative natural kind strategy, the strategy for investigating consciousness in science that many authors have argued for, in a nutshell, the idea is to treat consciousness as a natural kind, which iteratively explains observable patterns and correlations between potentially consciousness-relevant features in nature, where natural kinds are classes of things with underlying, not socially constructed similarities and differences in their natures. So water is a natural kind because all instances of water share the same chemical structure, H2O. Things happening on Tuesdays is not a natural kind because actually things happening on Tuesdays can all be like very, very different from each other in all kinds of unstructured ways. The strategy doesn't need to assume like some very sophisticated a very demanding notion of natural kind when you think of natural kinds as these kinds of homeostatic property clusters, so as things which correlate in virtue of shared causal properties. So the general idea on that strategy, to go a little bit more into detail, is to first like find agreement on some pre-theoretical measures of consciousness, because we need such measures to be able to like study consciousness or study anything in science. To first be able to scientifically investigate some phenomenon, we need some idea of like how to measure it or how to detect it, at least. And this depends on pre-theoretical principles. So when we're actually starting to do consciousness science, we cannot already presuppose some theory of consciousness that would be question begging. So these principles need to have some kind of minimal epistemic standing, independent of assuming already a particular theory of consciousness, and principles which are very plausible in the case of consciousness science to narrow down what the object of study is, are something like the better one sees something, the more likely one is to be conscious of it. So if people, like if humans at least, stand in front of something and have like clear, unobstructed view and they're like awake and healthy and so on, then they normally consciously see it. And second, people can usually tell whether they're conscious of something or not. So usually when you ask someone, like, did you see that? And they say yes, then it means they consciously saw it. And if they say no, then it means they didn't consciously see it. And these principles explain why we take things like perceptual discrimination abilities, be able to distinguish different kinds of stimuli, and verbal reports. So there's sort of setups where people are asked whether they saw some stimulus as measures of consciousness in consciousness science. So that's sort of the first idea in this iterative natural kind strategy. You use like pre-theoretical principles, like the one that sort of verbal reports normally, though not always, indicates consciousness. It's an initial set of measures of consciousness with at least minimal epistemic standing. Then you use these measures to calibrate each other. So you can see when, for instance, the two measures based on verbal report and based on perceptual discrimination, when they correlate and when they don't correlate. And then if they don't correlate, that's a reason to like trust them less because we don't have convergent evidence. And also to calibrate further derived measures of consciousness. So you might see that maybe verbal report correlates with certain learning abilities. You can always do certain kinds of associative learning when you are able to verbally report a certain stimulus. And then you use might conclude that, okay, these learning abilities are also measures of consciousness and not just the initial pre-theoretical measures we started out with. And then you can use the pre-theoretical and the derived measures to search for like clusters of consciousness-relevant features, abilities for verbal report, learning abilities, certain neural properties which correlate with ability for verbal report and learning abilities, psychological features, behavioral features, everything. And you see how they cluster, so to what extent they correlate, and when these correlations break down. And then the idea is that you iteratively apply inference to the best explanation to confirm the natural kind, or maybe the several natural kinds which underlie this and which explain why these features cluster or don't cluster. And then, crucially, this natural kind is identified with consciousness. So consciousness is like whatever this natural kind, which explains all these like clusters of consciousness relevant features, turns out to be. That's the idea. So that was the iterative natural kind strategy, the sort of scientific process we should use, on my view, to investigate consciousness, including in non-human systems. The second idea was this idea of psychological duplicates. So just terminologically, when I say possible, henceforth, I mean nomologically possible. So saying AI systems are possible means sort of AI systems are, it's possible that they're conscious means it's compatible with the laws of nature. That they're conscious doesn't mean that we can, especially not today, build conscious AI systems, but it's also a stronger claim than just saying there's no conceptual contradiction in conscious AI. And with AI systems, I mean like conventional silicon-based and non-biological systems, not AI systems made from like unusual kinds of materials. So one assumption I'm making is this claim that I call psychological duplication, which I'm still like working out how exactly it's supposed to work. But the general idea is that psychological duplicates are possible. And you might imagine psychological duplicates as something like philosophical zombies in Dave Chalmers' sense. So creatures which are like behaviorally the same at least on some level of description, as like normal adult healthy humans, and also functionally the same and have the same internal functional organization. But crucially, and like differently than Chalmers describes his zombies, they're made from different kinds of materials. So psychological duplicates on this views are like AI systems, so they're not biological. They're made from silicon-based materials, versus humans, of course, are not. So, in other words, psychological duplicates are AI systems which share the behavioral and the coarse-grained functional features of normal conscious humans. So just roughly to clarify a little bit more what that means, functional properties are individuated by the causal role, i.e. by just the outputs that they produce to given inputs, can be characterized on like various levels of description, abstractions, more coarse-grained and more fine-grained. And the idea is that this causal structure is shared between humans and psychological duplicates. Yeah, I think I'm going to leave that out. I will not really defend this psychological duplication assumption here, that psychological duplicates are possible, although we can't talk about it in discussion. I just want to note that it's weaker than the assumption that actually AI systems which are conscious are possible. So there are many kinds of views which would imply that psychological duplicates are not conscious. For instance, mind-brain identity theories would imply that psychological duplicates, even though they share the functioning and the behavior of humans, are not conscious just because they're made from the right kind of stuff, from the wrong kind of stuff. They lack brains. And since brains, having a certain brain state is just what consciousness is, they're not conscious. Okay. So this now is the main argument, which I currently call the anticipatory argument, because it's sort of anticipating what result an ideal scientific process would give us to questions about AI consciousness. So the first premise, and we're going to go through this in detail, is that the outcome of an ideal application of the iterative natural kind strategy, that process that we just sketched, is that some possible AI systems are conscious. Like if that's the case, then some possible AI systems are conscious. So that means basically we should defer to this ideal version of the iterative natural kind strategy when making attributions of consciousness. Second premise says that the outcome of an ideal application of this strategy, the iterative natural kind strategy, is actually that some possible AI systems are conscious. And then it follows that some possible AI systems are conscious. And just to remind you, possible here means nomologically possible. So the question is now, why should we believe the premises, given that sort of this argument is obviously logically valid? Is it also sound? So the first premise said that if this iterative natural kind strategy says that AI systems are conscious, then we should believe that. With an ideal application of the strategy, I mean like a fictional hypothetical application where researchers have like unlimited resources, including time, perfect reasoners, and are immune to performance errors. So we're doing sort of what the strategy prescribes and are not making any sort of errors. We are idealizing away from like normal epistemic shortcomings. So that seems to suggest that, okay, if like the iterative natural kind strategy at all can tell us which creatures are conscious, then this like idealized version will actually tell us correctly. And I think it's plausible that we should defer to that kind of strategy because, I mean, that needs more defense, but in some sense, it seems like this strategy is just a high-level description of the process that science generally employs to investigate putative natural kinds, like in all kinds of domains, and science on some liberal notion of natural kind arguably is just about studying natural kinds. So it's sort of hard to reject that we should, sort of to the extent that we defer to science, should defer to that kind of process. And arguably, we should defer to science on these questions, like the question whether biological views of consciousness are true seems like a scientific question in some sense. It doesn't seem like like such a general and fundamental question that metaphysical reasoning can really help us much. It's not really clear how to make like non-empirical, non-scientific progress on this issue of AI consciousness. So that was the first premise. We should defer to that ideal and natural kind strategy. So the second premise said that the outcome of an ideal application of that strategy is that some possible AI systems are conscious. And that's last and biggest part of the argument. Why would we believe that? So my test case here are like psychological duplicates. So these systems, a little bit like zombies, which are in terms of their causal structure, in terms of their behavior, the same as humans. I argue are nomologically possible. Would they be conscious, or would the intuitive natural kind strategy attribute consciousness to them? And I think we can already predict that at least if consciousness has this sort of like a sufficiently natural kind-like structure, that an ideal version of that strategy will actually attribute consciousness to AI systems. So an ideal version of that strategy will find which clusters of cognitive capacities and patterns of cognitive and behavioral effects which are shared by humans, other conscious animals, and psychological duplicates. That just follows from assuming that these systems are actually psychological duplicates, and also shared computational mechanisms between humans, other animals, and duplicates, which explain these clusters. But they will also find some biological properties which are part of this cluster in human and non-human animals, but are absent in psychological duplicates. For instance, the neocortex likely is involved in consciousness in humans, and by assumption, psychological duplicates don't have biological and brain properties like these. And so my claim is that given this situation, an ideal iterative natural kind strategy will identify consciousness with the mechanisms which underlie like the shared coarse-grained functional properties between like humans, animals, and duplicates, rather than fine-grained biological properties which are not shared between humans and psychological duplicates. And the reason are basically theoretical virtues which guide the natural kind strategy in all kinds of domains. So just positing a shared coarse-grained functional mechanism which is identified with consciousness seems very unifying. We posit the same kind of process, consciousness, to explain phenomena related to biological and non-biological creatures, and we license predictions and explanations which cut across biological and non-biological creatures. We can also explain why these features are shared between biological organisms and psychological duplicates, like behavioral and computational features. Biological views cannot really use consciousness for unified explanations for like the classes of capacities and effects in biological, non-biological species which are shared with psychological duplicates. So they have two options, and I think that both are unsatisfactory. One is to posit two mechanisms, to say that there's like a biological mechanism which explains the clusters of capacities and effects, including the biological ones that we find in biological creatures, and then a different non-biological one which explains the same phenomena, excluding biological phenomena in non-biological creatures, and then say, okay, the biological mechanism is identical to consciousness, but that seems like less unifying, simple, and explanatory than this account where we think there's a shared computational mechanism which explains similarities in human and duplicate behavior and cognition. It actually lacks an explanation for why there are these shared features between biological and non-biological creatures. That just leaves that unexplained. So in this version, biological proponents of biological views just posit two distinct mechanisms for explaining behaviors in biological creatures, psychological duplicates. That's sort of disunifying. The other option is to grant that there's a shared coarse-grained functional mechanism which explains the classes of features between the shared features between humans and psychological duplicates, but argue that consciousness is actually distinct from this shared mechanism, and that consciousness depends on the specific properties that we only find in biological creatures. But this is just inconsistent with the iterative natural kind strategy that we started out with. So the strategy is precisely the idea that we should study consciousness as a natural kind, that we should identify consciousness with the natural kind, which underlies these clusters of consciousness relevant features and explains them if we are saying, okay, there are these coarse-grained functional mechanisms which are shared between humans and psychological duplicates, and they explain most of the features, most of the sort of consciousness-relevant features that we started out with. Then saying that consciousness is just distinct from the mechanism which does this explanatory work is inconsistent with the iterative natural kind strategy, and also makes it sort of unclear how you could ever know, scientifically at least, which AI systems are conscious. I think that at least two further reasons for thinking we should identify consciousness of the functional mechanism which is shared between humans and psychological duplicates, and not with a biological mechanism which is not shared. One is that it's just plausible to say that even though like psychological duplicates lack these biological features in our cluster of consciousness relevant features, it's plausible to say that that's because these features are just not applicable to non-biological creatures, rather than that this shows that these creatures lack consciousness. It's something we in generally often do with the iterative natural kind strategy, that we think certain measures of consciousness are actually only applicable in some populations, but not in others. For instance, verbal report as a measure is not really applicable to non-human animals. Similarly, just biology-based measures of consciousness might just not be applicable to AI systems. And second, the cluster which is of features which is actually shared between humans and psychological duplicates contains features of phenomena which are particularly central to our pre-theoretical conception of consciousness, stuff like the ability to verbal report or for visual discrimination, whereas the stuff which is not shared, something like involvement of the prefrontal cortex or something, is not central to our pre-theoretical notion of consciousness. And I at least take it to be plausible that since this pre-theoretical conception of consciousness is the initial starting point for consciousness science, it should be to some extent also reflected in the natural kind that consciousness science eventually converges on. So, recap of the argument. First premise says we should defer to like science and questions of AI consciousness, and we should especially defer to this iterative natural kind strategy if it's like sufficiently idealized. And the second argument says, okay, based on sort of inference to the best explanation considerations, an account which explains behavior in humans and some possible AI systems, by positing that consciousness shared between them is like more explanatory than an account which denies that AI systems can be conscious. So it follows that some possible AI systems are conscious. So the upshot, importantly, is not just that psychological duplicates, like these weird hypothetical AI systems, are conscious. So if psychological duplicates can be conscious, then that seems to entail that consciousness in general can be realized by the kinds of materials which constitute conventional AI systems. It would be really weird to have the view that consciousness can be realized by such materials in psychological duplicates, but not in any other kinds of AI systems. That's ad hoc. And I think it's also inconsistent with the view that I just argued for, that consciousness should be identified with a coarse-grained functional kind in the psychological duplicate case, because of course other AI systems can instantiate the relevant functional kind. So if all of this is correct, and if, as I said at the beginning, sort of a lot hinges for the debate on AI consciousness on this question whether consciousness requires biology, then it seems to suggest that indeed there are no like obvious barriers to building conscious AI systems. Although, of course, it doesn't imply that like current AI systems are conscious or language models are conscious, and so on. And there might be unobvious barriers for implementing the right kinds of computations that we don't know of yet. And it seems to follow that near-term AI consciousness is at least a serious possibility. Of course, the argument I made rested on certain assumptions which are not obvious and which I didn't have like all the space to defend and which are also not easy to defend. One is that these psychological duplicate creatures are actually nomologically possible. Now, there's that this question of AI consciousness is indeed one where we should defer to science rather than, for instance, metaphysics or ethics. The third is that the outputs of the science of consciousness should conform specifically to like an ideal iterative natural kind strategy and not some other kind of methodology. I have some arguments for some of these views, but yeah, the matter is not settled. If one remains skeptical of these assumptions, then my conclusion can be taken as a conditional. If these assumptions are correct, then if I'm correct, then it follows that a non-biological AI consciousness is possible. Thank you very much for your attention. And yeah, I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Leonard. So now we'll move on to Q&A. Let's see if there are some questions in the room. Mitch?
Thanks, Leonard. I enjoyed that very much. It really bothers me. I can't figure out what I think about consciousness systems. So I appreciate your arguments. They're very insightful. But I guess I'm wondering about whether or not the principle of inference to the best explanation can be turned, so to speak, against you to challenge the premises of the argument. It's like this. Suppose we're building an android that behaves as intelligently as a regular human being does. We're going to need to set it up so that when a heavy stone falls on its toe, it exhibits pain behavior. And so forth. Now, if it were a regular human being, we could depend upon the role of C fibers and such to do the job of making the regular human being say, ouch, when the rock falls on the person's toe. But in the case of the android, we're going to have to program it differently, build it differently so that it emits that, engages in various kinds of protecting behavior and so forth, maybe utters some expletives. And now I feel like that general picture is going to generalize so that we're going to build androids to exhibit pain behavior. But I'm not sure if we get any explanatory gain by saying they have any conscious experience of pain or whatever other qualia you want to attribute to them. So the idea is this: for any argument that you think the INKS strategy could justify positing consciousness in, for example, androids, I think I can come up with a better theory that's just like yours, but it's more parsimonious, treating consciousness as just an unnecessary posit, because we've got a more fundamental but still satisfactorily explanatory explanation in mechanical terms of why the android or whatever behaves the way it does. So I might be missing something in your argument, but I feel like I wonder if it's vulnerable to an inference of best explanation rejoinder that says, I can explain everything you can in your hypothetical scenarios, but without a positive consciousness, because we look at how engineers are going to have to build these androids, we're going to have to say, oh, well, they built this special circuits that when a stone falls on the toe, or toe-like thing that this android has, it says, ouch, and swears like a sailor or whatever else. And I think the general point would apply across the board to perceptual awareness and seeming behavior, pleasure and pain, and so forth, so-called self-consciousness. So I'd like to hear what you think about that.
Okay, thank you very much. That's an interesting challenge. I don't have a ready-made answer yet because there are I think maybe several ways in which this objection could be fleshed out, and different thoughts on different ones. So one is sort of, this mechanical system, depending on how you describe this android, could just be much more simpler than humans, and then maybe you wouldn't need an explanation and the same kinds of mental terms. And that would, of course, not be a problem for my view. Another possibility is, one might go with this sort of, if the system is as complex as like a human in its behavior and so on, then one might think, okay, there's like a defeating explanation, namely the system only exhibits this behavior because we like designed it specifically so that it exhibits like human pain behavior, and then one doesn't need consciousness and explanation, just sort of the explanation that it was designed with the purpose to mimic human behavior and so on, and that's why it does it, which is interesting. I think two possible responses there are, one, that I think I can just stipulate that that's not true of sort of the hypothetical cases I'm interested in, like these psychological duplicate cases. And another one, like another response is that, like in many cases, it seems to me that this sort of explanation that the system was designed to exhibit certain behavior, and that's why it exhibits behavior, doesn't necessarily compete with explanations in terms of consciousness. It could be that the system exhibits that behavior precisely by being conscious, and which maybe sort of leads to the general point that I think for many kinds of physical sort of explanations you could give, instead of like a consciousness explanation for behavior of artificial systems, it's not clear like whether these are explanations which actually sort of rule out consciousness explanations or are just redescribing the system in a certain way. We heard about like this redescription fallacy with LLMs yesterday. Yeah, and I guess to some extent I just have sort of this methodological commitment that if we take consciousness seriously as something which can be scientifically investigated, it seems to me that we just have to assume that like consciousness is sort of whatever does the relevant explaining. And then like many of these cases where you have these sort of explanatory structures, but sort of behavior, but stipulate that they're distinct from consciousness, fall out as
I think
inconsistent.
thanks for that. If I can have a quick response.
Sure.
I mean, I'm assuming that we agree that the Android or whatever it is not going to have a wetware brain or central nervous system. They're going to
Yeah.
have engineers are going to have to build them with the intention of having the behavior that humans do in response to the sorts of stimuli that we respond to in an appropriate way. That is to say, even if presumably, the Android is going to have skin-like stuff covering its foot, etc., and it's therefore going to be programmed to behave in such ways to exhibit pain behavior when the rock falls on the foot. That's going to have to be design built in to the system that the engineers are going to make. Just having it, it's going to have to do sort of self-protecting behavior and so forth. And my thought is, I agree with you about the redescription fallacy. I still want to explain the thing behavior in functional terms. But my argument is, appeal to phenomenal consciousness is not going to do further work than what we've already done, which is a functional explanation in terms of the actual architecture of this system. So I'm not quite.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, in some sense, of course, yes, like if you're a physicalist of some kind, then appealing to the functional architecture will do all of the explanatory work that consciousness does. But that doesn't rule out that consciousness actually does some explanatory work, because these things are actually not like metaphysically independent, right?
Right. Well, I'm getting lost in the non-logical necessities here. I guess my thought is, I don't know how to rule out my sort of lower level explanation is not going to logically entail that there's no consciousness in this Android, but it will make the positive of consciousness unnecessary. And therefore, the inference of the best explanation will say, choose the more parsimonious theory. Mitch is not Leonard's.
Yeah, but I mean, the question at stake seems to be whether like the sort of functional explanation that you give of Android behavior, if that already sort of describes functional processes which are sufficient for consciousness being there. And then my idea is something like we have all of these sort of features which are in consciousness science taken to be sort of relevant, like verbal behavior, perceptual discrimination, effects on memory, and so on. And if you take consciousness seriously as something that can be like investigated scientifically, and of course it's not like third person observable, then you will just identify consciousness with whatever thing sufficiently explains like these kinds of features. So if then if you actually have a robot which is like in all of these ways is sort of cognitively and behaviorally the same as humans, and these functional features in its architecture explain its behavior, then that's good reason to think that these functional features are already like identical to or sufficient for consciousness.
I understand. I have something to say in response to that, but I don't want to.
Great, good, excellent. So before I hand it over to you, one, I had a quick question of my own. So Leonard, this is gonna be quite flat-footed. I'm very sympathetic to what you're saying. I think in Harold Langham's words, right, consciousness is wonderful. So I'm fully on board with what you're saying. Now, my question is going to be really sort of flat-footed, sort of undergrady, right? So throughout your talk, you kept saying, yeah, that's right. You want no offense. You kept saying shared functional mechanism, right? And so now I'm like, cool, what is it? It sounds as though this is all a bit too verbose for something we have little, if any, inkling of, right? And somebody might sort of up the ante a bit and say, look, with enough ingenuity, right, we can cook up these boxological models, right, all we want. And so that would seem to water down the idea of shared functional mechanism. And so I'm just wondering if it does the explanatory weightlifting that you wanted to do.
Yeah. In general, it's of course like an open scientific question what sort of the shared functional mechanisms would be if there are nomologically possible systems which share sort of many or like all behavioral or cognitive properties of humans. It seems sort of plausible to think, okay, there would need to be like some mechanism which explains why these features are shared. And then, I mean, one challenge could be, okay, if you just talk about behavioral duplicates, then maybe there could be systems with very different kinds of mechanisms of behavior. And then the shared mechanism would turn out to be very abstract. I don't think it's a big problem in the sense that, okay, I'm not just talking about sort of behavioral duplicates, but also the idea is that in the sense of sort of like relevant causal structure, the like mind of the systems or like sort of the coarse-grained functional features and like brain and mind are shared. And also, I mean, it could be that these functional mechanisms need to be quite abstract. In some sense, they have to be if it's stuff which is shared between like humans and many kinds of animals and many kinds of AI systems. And it needs to be very abstract, but it's not maybe a problem in the sense that if we think that AI systems can have memory and humans can have memory and animals can have memory, then we also sort of are committed to positing some very like abstract, like not specific kinds of like causal properties which are sufficient for memory.
Right, but if you want to characterize the shared functional mechanism in terms of relevant causal structure, that just kicks the problem upstairs, right? What's the relevant causal structure?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, at the end, that would depend on, I think, just what the right computational theory of consciousness turns out to be, right? It could be a global workspace, it could be some higher order kind of mechanism, it could be something else. I try to be neutral on that
Right.
issue.
Okay, good, great, thank you. Yuan has been waiting for a while. Thanks for your patience. Please go ahead.
Good, thank you. That's Leonard. Thanks, Leonard. It's a very interesting discussion about this, and I'm happy that people bring this back and forth, the problem of consciousness in machines. But I have a question here about what is the value when you talk about natural kinds? You think what is the best theory we have about how consciousness came out? And I guess you need to ground it or to ground it in some form of evolutionary theory that we kind of all believe. And I'm curious if in this case, the natural kind of consciousness, if there is such a thing, can be integrated somewhere in the evolutionary theory, that evolution doesn't stop at the neck somehow. Yeah, it goes to the head and to the brain. So therefore, consciousness should be captured by and grounded into this evolutionary theory. And if you think about that, then machines as we know them, as far as we know now, they don't have that kind of specific feature. They are developed by humans, but that's not exactly a form of evolution as we expected. Now, I'm curious, some people say there is evolutionary computation. I agree with that. I actually worked a little bit on that. But I'm just curious what you think about this kind of grounding consciousness, all forms of consciousness in some form of evolution, and avoid this kind of any kind of dualism here, because dualism, of course, can say, "Oh, evolution stops with the mind. It's evolution applies to everything except the mind." I'm just curious if evolution plays any role here.
Yeah. Um, yeah, very interesting. So I have some general thoughts on that, which is that in sort of the current stage of consciousness theorizing, where we're just very uncertain about just which basically causes and effects consciousness has, maybe even whether it in general has like causal end effects which are useful, but it seems plausible. I don't think that evolutionary considerations can play that much weight because sort of thinking about what consciousness could have been useful for in evolution, thinking about, okay, given like the selective pressures that organisms faced, what would we expect consciousness to do, or why would we expect consciousness to have been useful? That already assumes that we have some idea of like what the typical causes and effects of consciousness are. It seems like unclear how you can sort of think about how consciousness might have been useful if there's like no agreement about what it actually does in cognition, whether it's for learning or for perception or for reasoning or for like affective reactions and so on. So I don't like obviously like evolutionary context is very important for like all projects in cognitive science. I don't think we can sort of give it this like basic role where we can solve this issue of AI consciousness by starting with some kind of evolutionary account. My impression is that we actually need some better understanding of sort of the psychology of consciousness, which causes and effects it typically has until like some kind of evolutionary story can get off the ground. And then, of course, it's just very hard to say how it would generalize to AI systems. Like in the case of memory, like, I don't know, memory also has evolved, but that, I mean, in itself is not sufficient to say that like non-evolved systems cannot have memory. Maybe they can have sort of analogous pressures. Maybe just someone has built it in there. Yeah, that's sort of my general impression. I hope that answers some of the question.
Thank you. Yeah, one possible answer to this will be there is no like consciousness is like a spandrel, if you know what spandrel of evolution. It's just a decorative element. It's not like fingers or eyes, which are super important. It's less important. And then you decouple evolution from consciousness, and you ignore evolution in consciousness and conscious in evolution.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you. Yeah, that's a good answer. I like that. Okay.
Even if you think it's not a spandrel, even if you think it has some kind of function, there's just not much that you can, like evolutionary reasoning, that you can do before you have any idea of sort of what it causally does, even if you sort of assume that it does something. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Yuan, for a very effective and consciously reflected upon question. And so let's see, Mitch, you have a follow-up?
Yeah. I think it's a follow-up from what we talked about before. Cool. So I was looking at this lovely paper by Birch and Schnell and Clayton called Dimensions of Animal Consciousness. Where they see at least that cephalopods have got it. At least, and in a form of perceptual consciousness that might outstrip what human beings can do, for example, in tactile consciousness. And so, in this position, it sounds like you're committed to the following claim: that if we could build a cuttlefish duplicate out of synthetic materials, a cuttlefish android, then it would just, and it was functionally equivalent to real life cuttlefish figure around the seafloor, then it would have consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have to wait until somebody produces a human android. It's easier to, I guess, test your hypothesis than might meet the eye, because cuttlefish, I'm convinced cuttlefish have a form of at least perceptual consciousness, what these authors call P consciousness. Whether they've got evaluative or self-consciousness is another question, but they have perceptual consciousness. And so I think you're just committed to the view that if we could build a functional equivalent cuttlefish, then it has consciousness.
Interesting.
Are you cool with that commitment?
I think, I mean, I'm cool with half of it, which is that if you just assume that cuttlefish are conscious, then you could like run the same kind of argument with cuttlefish duplicates, like duplicates of their brain and mind and not human brains and minds. I don't think we can build like a functional duplicate of cuttlefish. Like we cannot build a robot which behaves, for instance, the same as cuttlefish in all kinds of situations. I mean, these creatures are also like very complex.
But they're much simpler than human beings. That might be something within 50 years as opposed to human android, which might take a couple thousand.
Sorry, what did you say?
Yeah, I would think cuttlefish are much simpler than human beings. Neurally, they're surely much more primitive than we are.
Yeah.
It's much more feasible technologically to build a cuttlefish android than human.
Interesting. I mean, maybe I would have thought just a big part of like sort of science fiction, if we put our science fiction hats on, a big part of the challenge of building sort of systems which are duplicates of like biological organisms in like the overall causal structure is also just like doing simple behavioral control correct in all kinds of situations and responding correctly to like perceptions and having like the effective processing right and so on, and that maybe the like sort of higher cognition stuff, which more distinguishes humans and cuttlefish, is not even the most challenging bit. Yeah. I think if we can build like duplicates of complete psychological duplicates of cuttlefish, then we're also already like 90% of the way of being able to build them from humans.
But just to be clear, you're willing to accept the commitment that if we could build a cuttlefish android, all out of synthetic materials, nothing biological, then it's got consciousness. It's conscious, at least in the sense of perceptual consciousness. These objects.
If Android really in the sense of like psychological duplicates, so also has sort of things which correspond to like the things caused by like affective processing and so on, then yes.
Yeah, just a brief follow-up on that. If I don't know what it's like to be a bat, I don't know what it's like to be a cuttlefish, right? And so I could very well agree with the claim that you could perhaps bridge the consciousness gap for cuttlefish and be entirely agnostic, ignorant, Mysterian, etc., about what that might say for humans, right? So it just sounds as though it just suggests, I mean, if Nagel was at all right back in the day, that this is species specific, right?
Yeah, I mean, there are ways in which you can, like, the different things that bridging the consciousness gap can mean. So what I just accepted, I guess, is that the right kind of like duplicates of cuttlefish, like duplicates which duplicate like behavioral and causal structure, um, would be conscious, which I mean, in some sense, maybe bridges some kind of consciousness gap if we can sort of build physical things, which then would be conscious if we build them in the right way. It doesn't necessarily bridge like epistemic gaps, like even if you could build like a robotic bat which is conscious, like Nagel's argument might still stand if for independent reasons you think the argument is plausible. We might still not then just not know like what it's like to be also this robot bat, sort of the epistemic concerns that we just don't know from a first person perspective what it's like to be that kind of organism would also apply to artificial systems. I think they're not affected by that kind of thing.
It would be fun to see the world through the eyes of a cuttlefish. Yeah, yeah. Awesome. Thanks so much. Let's see if there are some more questions, comments, rejoinders in the room or online. If not, please join me in thanking Leonard once.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting.